For the invitation to attend tonight's Committee of the Whole meeting. As discussed at the October 18th board meeting, we are here tonight to share the student census data as it relates to suspensions. That was referenced in the report, so I'm not going to go over the report again, but this is the data piece that was missing. I'd like to, again, take this opportunity to thank Dr. Rosanna Biseglia and her research team for helping to set the context in order to discuss this data with you. And I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Biseglia.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. There's some new faces that I haven't seen before. It's a pleasure always to be here. And I'm hoping that we can keep things light and interactive. So please feel free to ask questions along the way. So today I'm here to talk about, of course, the disproportionalities in suspensions and expulsions. But I also would like to ensure that we have a shared understanding or a shared framework for how to interpret the information that I'm about to present. So we'll talk about what does it mean to have proportionalities and disproportionalities, and we'll do so through examples to keep things light. But I am inviting you on a learning journey. There's been lots of learning that I've had to do as I've embarked on this work. And so I'm inviting each of you to hold space for each other because we're all at different places in our learning journey, but also to own your own particular learning and hold yourself accountable for the learning that is required of us. So with that in mind, I'm asking you to set a personal intention. So this is done privately in your mind. Set a personal intention for today's learning. This slide comes from the authors of a book, Street Data, that talks about transforming educational systems in a just way. And so they talk about these intentions when we're receiving information, recognizing that no one knows everything, but together we know a lot. So each one of us has unique experiences, unique expertise, unique knowledge. Sharing the knowledge with one another enhances all of our understanding. Another intention is to embrace an abundance mindset. So sometimes when we think about disproportionalities and the world that we live in and the various risks that communities face, sometimes it feels overwhelming to think about, what can we do to address the trauma or whatever risk factors that students face? So here today, I'm inviting you to embrace an abundance mindset, to think about the possibilities as opposed to think about what is not possible. Another intention is that we can't be articulate all the time. Sometimes our thoughts sound really good in our mind, but then when they come out, they don't sound so articulate. And that is just being human. And so we are going to be, graceful to each other and assume positive intent, but also understand that there is an impact. And the intention at the center speaks to the importance of having an open heart and an open mind when receiving this information. Because we want to ensure that we're centering the voices of those students who are being disproportionately impacted in society at large and in our educational system. So I'll give you just a few seconds to just think about a personal intention that you'd like to set for yourself before we begin looking at the information. So before we get into the data, I thought that we would have a little bit of fun to think about how can we have a shared model for understanding proportionalities. So let's imagine that we're going to play a little game. We each have a loonie in front of us, and we're going to flip this coin. And we know that by flipping that coin, we have a 50-50% chance of getting heads or getting tails. Now, let's say that our chair and vice chair want to be the first one to go and play the game on their own, and they're going to flip and flip and flip and flip. What would we expect to be the outcome of those flips? Would it be any different than the original sort of flip that we had done? We would expect it to be the same, right? So the probability doesn't change irrespective of which trustee is flipping that coin. So let's say that Trustee Ahmed and Trustee Daniele also want to join in on the fun, and they start flipping the coin, and we're still having an expected outcome of around 50-50%. Now, all of the trustees are wanting to join in on the fun. I couldn't fit all of the faces in there, but all of the names are in there. And you can see that if we continue to flip the coin, we have a proportionate outcome between heads and tails. Sometimes a little bit more heads, sometimes a little bit more tails, but overall, we're hovering around that 50% mark. So that is the expected outcome. That is what we would describe as a balanced and proportionate outcome in what we would be expecting to see based on what we know to be true of when we toss a coin. And that is simply, that's what proportions are. Okay, it's a part, share, or number considered in comparative relation to a whole. So our comparative relation with the flipping the coin is 50%. We know that to be true. We're not going to question that. We accept that to be true. Proportionality is the quality of corresponding in size or amount to something else. So I can say that our vice chair perhaps tossed tails more than heads, but relatively speaking, we're still hovering around that 50% mark. So yes, we can flip and flip and flip, and we expect a 50-50 split. But what if we see something like this? So now we're seeing that specific trustees are showing a different pattern of results. So we see, for example, that Trustee Ahmed and Rosha are more likely to toss heads, while Trustee Bryden and Sribalan are more likely to toss tails. So now we're starting to see disproportionalities. We are no longer seeing results that are hovering around that balanced mark. So while it is true, if you go home tonight and you get your loonie and you start tossing away, it is possible that you might get 8 tails out of the 10 trials that you toss. Okay, it's possible. However, if you continue to toss the coin, eventually that probability will converge to a 50-50 split. And that speaks to the importance of looking at trends over time, as opposed to looking at specific individual trials. Okay, any questions so far? So now we have a shared understanding of what a disproportionality is. Disproportionate means being too large or too small in comparison with something else. And disproportionality is essentially just being out of proportion. It's a very straightforward definition. But somehow when we start to talk about disproportionality in the context of human outcomes, there's confusion. So we'll just stick to the coin as our general framework, and then we'll add in the human outcomes slowly. But I want you to remember that there is an expected outcome that is based in theory. We don't just make it up. It's based on mathematical equations, modeling, statistics. There is a real expected outcome that one is looking for. So proportions matter. They are all around us. And I invite you to think about if you were an adult with baby feet, you might have the cutest feet within your adult friends, but you would face some significant challenges going around the world and literally and figuratively keeping pace with your peers. And unfortunately, we live in a world where we know this to be true, that there's societal patterns that show that there's specific communities that disproportionately are impacted by risk factors, whether that's poverty, whether that's health disparities, whether that is educational disparities. We know that to be true. So from a human rights perspective, we don't expect a 50-50 outcome. That is not the expected outcome. So what is that expected outcome from a human rights perspective? When we look at the Human Rights Code, when we look at our provincial anti-racism directorate standards, even our Ministry of Education equity strategy, they tell us that the percentage of individuals in a given outcome or program or opportunity should be comparatively proportionate to their representation in the population. So there is a balance between the expected proportion that we have in our HDSB population and the observed proportion in the outcome or programs. So what does that mean? Well, actually, before we say what does that mean, why is that? So let's say that we have a question about who is in our gifted programming. And the way that I would phrase that question is, what are the student proportions, right? So who are the students that are proportionately represented in the gifted programming? We have the HDSB population on the left and our outcome on the right. A disproportionality in an outcome in the gifted program, for example, and I didn't know that Colette was presenting today, so that's completely, but a disproportionality would imply that for students of various communities, their intelligence is distributed differently than what would be expected from the normal distribution. So I won't go into the normal distribution at great length, but just to say that human traits are normally distributed by and large. So we have specific proportions that are represented on this normal distribution. To expect that certain communities would be represented in the gifted program or whatever outcome at higher rates or lower rates than their student population would imply that for that community, their intelligence or whatever human trait you want to change are not normally distributed. And that is simply not true. Going back to that 50-50% of the coin, it would imply that only certain communities have a normal distribution that's shown in the red line, and that other communities have either a green distribution or a narrow distribution or no distribution at all. So that is just not what we know to be true from statistical models, mathematical models, and models of human behavior and human evolution. So some real world data of how this plays out before I get into the HDSB, and we're getting there, I promise. So there was a review of the Toronto Police Service, all charges. So this is looking at their database of all criminal charges. And the question was whether the Black community in Toronto is over or under or equitably distributed or represented in the charges in the Toronto Police Service. So if we continue with this logic of what we know to be true and what would be an expected outcome from what we know to be true, Statistics Canada states that the Black population in Toronto is 8.8%, and this was 2015, I believe. A proportional representation in all charges would predict approximately 8.8%. In reality, Black population consists of 32% of all charges in their database. So we have a disproportionality there. What we also know to be true is that other racial groups and white individuals are actually underrepresented in their data. So you have an overrepresented population for one community and an underrepresented statistics for another community. Likewise for child welfare. So this is looking at children who were removed from the home and placed in care. Again, for Black population in Toronto, 8.8%. We would expect that to be the proportional. And what we know to be true is that 40% of children in care are Black. That is a huge disproportionality. So we followed this process when we examined our student suspensions and expulsions, in addition to a number of additional outcomes that have been presented here in the past. So for tonight, I'll be speaking about the suspensions and expulsions for gender at registration, gender identity, sexual orientation, special education status, multilanguage learner, and race or racial identity. So we've talked about proportions in the population versus proportions in the outcome. One way to put all of that information together is to develop what is referred to as a disproportionality index. And this index gives you that expected outcome. So we know that life is way more difficult than 50-50. But what is that expected outcome that we would expect to see if our suspensions and expulsions follow a just model, meaning that everyone has an equal represented community profile in our database. So the formula that I will offer here, and this was given to us by the ARD, the Anti-Racism Directorate, is simply the percentage of students from Group A, whether that is our multilanguage learners, our learners with special education needs, in a particular program or outcome. So in this particular example, we're talking about suspensions, over or divided by the percentage of students from that group in the overall population. So again, we're talking about overall population and the expected outcome. So as an example, this is fake data, but I just want you to see how all of this comes together to get at that index. So let's say that in HDSB, and again, this is fake data, girls make up 10% of our population. And we wanted to know what is the disproportionality index for suspensions when it comes to girls. And let's say that girls represent 30% of our suspensions and expulsions, but yet they represent 10% of our population. So when we put together the formula, 30% divided by 10%, that gives us an index of 3. So how do we interpret that? We interpret that by saying that girls are 3 times more likely to be suspended than their representation in the population would predict. That is our index. And the expected outcome, again, would be a 1. So the first variable of interest that we looked at is gender at registration. So this is not gender identity. This is gender at registration. And at the time, it was a binary field. And so we do only have female and males as gender at registration. The black line is the expected outcome of 1. So that would be parity. That would mean that there is a correspondence between the population and the actual representation in the outcome, which is suspensions and expulsions. So we have data for 2 years here represented, and so we can see that boys are 1.57 times more likely to be suspended than their representation in the population would predict. And that's for 21-22. And for 22-23, the pattern holds true. They are still 1.54 times more likely to be suspended or expelled relative to their proportion in the population. Females are actually underrepresented based on what their representation in the population is. So a question that, comes for me as I support schools and I support the various leaders of the board is, of course, what is leading to this, right? And what are some response strategies that we can implement to mitigate against whatever forces are happening that would result in these disparities. But certainly the conclusion that there's something innate within boys that makes them more likely or more prone to suspensions and expulsions is not the conclusion that we would hope that any of us would land on. The next variable is gender identity. So this is how students identify on their own on our student census. And there was a various list of different gender identity options, and those were collapsed in the term gender diverse because we simply did not have sufficient numbers in each of those categories to be able to do a proper statistical analysis. So across the 2 years, we still see the trend where students who identify as boy-man are 1.6 or 1.5 more likely to be suspended or expelled relative to their proportion in their population. For sexual orientation, again, we have straight and heterosexual and then sexual diversity, and this is again a self-report by students. And here we actually are at parity. So we have proportionate outcomes. So that is an area of success for us, but it does lead to some questions as to why, again, from a programming perspective, that this is the case. For students with special education, and that specifically applies to IEP, so as long as there was an IEP flag associated with students, they are included here. We have disproportionalities with students with an IEP being 1.77 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, whereas students with no IEP are actually underrepresented. So a question that pops in my mind, even as a parent, is, how well are we supporting our students with special education needs if it reaches a point of suspensions and expulsions? Our multi-language learners is another area where we do see parity. And so we are seeing that expected proportionalities relative to their representation in the population. And then we have racial identity. We have data for the 2 years. And I'll note that this is very similar trend to other school boards where our Indigenous and Black students, Middle Eastern, and Latino, Latinx is an interesting population because we actually did see an improvement in those disparities with the trend going down last year. But our Indigenous and our Black students are 1.7 to 1.3, 1.6 times more likely to be suspended and expelled. So again, following the logic of the normal distribution, following the logic of what we were saying about boys and girls, there's nothing about racial identity that makes one innately likely to be suspended. It is a systemic response and one that warrants attention. So, now what? Now, what do we do with this information? So as school leaders, we have a mandate, a legal obligation, and a moral obligation to ensure that our classrooms are just for every single student that walks through our door. And we respond in a number of ways. You know, there's the belief that disparities come about from external forces, whether that's, you know, poverty or other kind of societal influences. And so institutions ought to provide equal opportunities for every student, and that is our mandate and that is our goal. Another approach would be the equity approach, where everyone gets the supports they need. So this, in U.S. terms, is often referred to as affirmative action. But in this picture, you can see that one student has 2 boxes, another student has 1 box, and the other student has no boxes, and everybody can see. And so we might applaud and say, okay, great, we've done our job. Everybody can see the game. But there's also a just model, and the just model advocates for the removal of barriers. And so when we're thinking about disparities, our job is to think about what are the systemic barriers, and that is the mandate from the Anti-Racism Directorate, the Ontario Human Rights, our Ministry of Education. And that picture, the barrier is the wooden fence. So can we not just remove the wooden fence and replace it with a gate that allows everybody to see? And often what I hear is, but what about? And the slide is left blank on purpose. What about poverty? What about the students who are coming from war-stricken countries? They have trauma. What about students with, you know, several exceptionalities? They have really high needs. Can we possibly meet the needs of every single student and every single societal factor that comes into play? And perhaps it's a lofty goal, but I think as educational leaders, we ought to try. And so for this evening, I'll leave you with this analogy. You know, that when students enter our classrooms with their storms, whether that's poverty, whether that's drug addiction at their home, whether that's multiple exceptionalities, when those students meet our calm, co-regulation occurs. What does co-regulation look like? It's really that opportunity and that ability to be the best selves and to achieve their own specific potential. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I'll take questions.
Yep. Thank you for that. So I'm going to look to the speakers list if anyone has any questions. Go ahead, Robbie.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you for the presentation. A handful of things. First off, is this one of the things we were talking about is whether this is administrative data or survey data. Is this data tied to suspension records, or is this self-reported out of the student survey?
So the identity information comes from our student census, which received close to 90% participation rate. And then that, the census, you know, it's not a survey, it's a census. And so it was identifiable. It was linked to student number. And so we used the student number to then link it to all of the administrative data, IEP, suspensions, academic achievement, and so forth.
Okay, so then this is knowable for academic outcomes and could be applied to various other, I assume, is being applied?
It actually has already, and it's been presented at board last year, and it's actually available on the public webpage on HDSB student census. There are presentations there where academic achievement, the disproportionalities have been published there.
Okay. And then in this regard, in specific to suspensions and expulsions, I guess taking this and you know, in the report that we saw previously, that it was raised that we acknowledge these disproportions exist. How has that informed our behavior and action? And I think this is more of a question for Superintendent Fowler.
Absolutely. So I did talk a little bit, and there is some of it written in the report, but I'm happy to go through it a little bit more. Obviously, the knowledge and the acknowledgement and the awareness raising is sort of our first approach, and certainly that's something that we've been doing. So Dr. Pasheglia has been joining us at our Family of Schools meetings. We've been talking about the data, and we've been bringing that awareness to everyone's attention. This year, we're really truly focused on partnering with our Human Rights, Equity, Inclusive Education Department, as well as our Indigenous Rights and Inclusive Education Department, and finally our Student Health and Mental Wellbeing Department. So Safe Schools, for example, is partnering with all of those departments in order to engage in what we'd like to call a human rights approach to progressive discipline. We are looking at things like helping our administrators to understand mitigating circumstances, helping them understand their own bias and recognizing the bias that they bring to any situation that they are working through. Having a framework of an anti-oppressive framework when they're discussing discipline matters, engaging student and parent voice in discipline matters and working with families, really focusing in on procedural fairness. You heard Dr. Pasheglia talk about a just classroom and really understanding the role that parents and students play in ensuring and upholding procedural fairness. We also really look at, and you've heard other departments talk before about a whole person approach and truly identity affirming spaces. So those two pieces would speak to that proactivity rather than the reactivity, which is where we really do want to spend our time. And so, there are a variety of different things that we're doing in the education piece, but also engaging in dialogue with administrators when they're making decisions. So our Safe Schools Department, whether it's Assistant Principal Coquel, myself, their own superintendent, perhaps reaching directly out to the system principals that are responsible for human rights, equity and inclusive education, Indigenous rights and education, student mental health and well-being. These people are all involved in consultation when there's a question, and we are asking to learn more about the student lived experiences as well as the identity of the student. And sort of taking all of that into account, we're really looking at developing a better critical consciousness that's going to help us make better and more just decisions. So that's kind of an overview of a lot of things, and I'd be happy to get into the specifics. I just don't know how much time we have tonight.
Time. Go ahead, Xinyi.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So first, thank you for this presentation. Before presenting the data and give us the knowledge about the statistics and the data analysis. So this is for all of us because we are not the specialists in this field. Thank you very much. And so for this purpose of this report, I noticed that in this report and this presentation, actually, they don't match for me. Because for this report, it presents the suspension and expulsion data in the past 3 school years. But the presentation is more about how to read this word. So, sorry. So but these issues are actually, there's no data support in this report. So in the final report, we will add the real data to support this claim. For example, this in the first page, the last paragraph. So this is ongoing issues, problems. We are doing the research and analysis. So because this report will guide us to make smarter decisions, or this can be 2 things we can do. For example, we need to allocate some resources for certain groups if they are facing challenges. So we need to allocate more resources for them. Or we can see some groups, they are facing some discrimination. And this is anti-racism or discrimination, the work, we need to add more work. We need to put more effort to do. So that means if we saw some group, they have higher representation in the data field, in the data, and we can see, does those cases are fairly treated? If this is fair, so I cannot say anything because under the human rights law, everybody must be fairly equally treated. If this is unfair treatment, then we need to consider this a discrimination. Do we have a systematic discrimination exist? So this is two different things we need to handle. There's another thing I just realized. One example in this presentation is that we need to remove the barriers. So barrier, of course, for students' achievement and well-being, we need to remove the barriers as much as possible to support them. But there's one thing we need to consider. Not all barriers are just we can remove or it's just we should remove. For example, at this 2-3 months, a lot of parents register their children to AP program, IB program, iSTEM program. For those programs, there's a limitation. So there's a number limitation of the seats for admission. So even in our website, it says this is competitive process. So this is not everyone. We can open the door to accept everyone who submitted the application. So this is, I believe this is also a very fair case. Thank you.
Just in the nick of time, Xinyi. So, go ahead.
I was just going to respond. So the initial report that was presented to you did not contain this data, as you remember, due to the fact that Dr. Bashegli wanted to come to discuss this. So I will work with her to ensure that when we bring the report as discussed next year, that the data is there. I'd also, consider if you feel that that's a necessary thing, I can work with her to see what that might look like in this report. But regardless of whether it was identified the specific numbers, which I think we have a little bit of caution around that number, we have acknowledged the disproportionality and the overrepresentation in this report, which does talk to the work we have to do, which helps to inform our decisions. So I just wanted to share that. And I don't know whether there is a second question in there. Oh, right, just around the just and the removal of barriers, which we'll leave.
I think it was an observation.
All right, next up is Carol.
Through the Vice Chair, thank you so much for that report. I think the timing, as you mentioned, having just had our PD on Spec Ed, the comment that students do as best as they can. All students want to do well and they do their best, and it's our job as adults to facilitate that. And I think this follows on really well from that. I just had two questions about the data. One was about the data around students with IEPs. Did you look at specific needs identified in those IEPs, or is it just student with IEP versus student without? And then I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So for the purpose of this data, it was IEP, all IEP, whether it's formally or informally, and it does include gifted, but we did not go further than that.
Okay, and then the second question is, I was just wondering how you decide which student characteristics to focus on. So you're looking at race, gender, and other immutable characteristics of students, but not socioeconomic status or characteristics, the existence of family supports or lack thereof. And I'm just wondering, is that information that you'd be looking at in the future, or if you could provide that?
So the variables of interest that were presented today, that comes from the mandate of our anti-racism directorate. We did add multilanguage learners because we know that we have a large proportion, and so to support. But we could do these analysis ad nauseum, really, and we could disaggregate and disaggregate and disaggregate. Ultimately, we do analysis to support planning and programming. So, and we know that socioeconomics, of course, is a factor that can hinder educational outcomes. And we have other processes in place for that. to ensure that there's equitable and fair and just resource allocations, and that every school has supports in place to support students at a disadvantage.
Amy?
Thank you. This is a question for the director, actually. I'm interested in seeing this type of analysis done in other areas, including EQAO. We do look at boys versus girls in IEPs versus students without IEPs and things like that, but to get a better sense of student achievement, it would be good to see for the literacy test, for the grade 9 math test, for all of those EQAO measures, perhaps graduation rates, students entering post-secondary, whether it's college, apprenticeship, university, workplace. It would be good to know that the demographics are moving through in the right proportions. And so I would love to see this kind of analysis done on more of the data that comes to us.
Thank you for that, Trustee Collard. Certainly, I can work with Dr. Bishalia around that data. I do know that the EQO, for example, that you referenced, they actually scaled back some of the data that they provided to school boards this past year. They used to give us a lot more detailed results down to the individual students, and they have moved away from that. So I don't know to what extent we have the capacity to correlate the information from them with what we know about our students. Dr. Bishalia?
So unfortunately, we could not do these analysis for EQAO because it was not available. In 2018, 2019, there was the job action, and then EQAO was paused for COVID. So this year is actually the first return for our grade 3 and our grade 6. And definitely we'll look to do the analysis. We do have academic achievement based on report card data for 2 years. And we also have graduation. We have access to programs, whether that's French immersion, IB. So we do have a lot more data than what was presented here this evening.
Thank you. I would just say that if EQAO continues to not give us the data at the individual student level, that they're prohibiting us from helping students who may be in great need. That information is pivotal when class building and determining what supports a student might need. I can't believe they're not providing that anymore.
So just to clarify, we do have individual student results. We used to have the individual student results even by questions within. So they would break it down so you would know on a particular exam or what the student was struggling with, and that we don't have. But we do we do know how each student is doing.
Thank you.
All right, there are no other speakers, so I'll ask my question. So I guess what prompted me to ask for numbers was the comment made in the report about the disproportionate outcomes for our students who identify as Black and Indigenous, gender diverse, sexually diverse, and students with IEPs. So what I was hoping to get today is the appendix that had been attached to the report. For example, it read there were 865 total suspensions between 1 and 20 days. Of those 865, how many were Black students? How many were Indigenous students? That's what I was hoping to get from today. And I understand the concept of disproportion, and thank you for sharing those numbers. Is there a way to get more numbers for this specific appendix so we know exactly what we're dealing with?
What would be most helpful is to share the disproportionality indices, because that is what would allow you to know the communities that are disproportionately represented in the suspensions and expulsions. And that is because when you think about from year to year, there's going to be fluctuations in the total number of suspensions and the total number of students. The disproportionality index, the way that it's calculated, accounts for those fluctuations. And so you have an expected outcome of 1, which does relate to the proportion in the population. And what you would look for over time is changes in those disproportionalities relative to that 1. So we can provide an appendix that has the disproportionality indices for all the gender registration, gender identity, all of the racial categories and so forth. But it would be amiss to have just straight numbers. It really is not as helpful, and it wouldn't be in keeping with why this information was gathered. It wouldn't be in keeping with best practices in addressing gaps systemically.
And if I may just add, the disproportionality index tells us all we need to know in terms of what actions we need to take. It's quite clear the data is consistent, and it is it's irrefutable. So I think for us as a board, we just need to apply what we know. Looking at some of the things that Superintendent Fowler mentioned earlier around our biases, the way we interact with communities and different identities, students with special education needs, how we as a staff, how we are interacting with them. That changes everything. Once we know the disproportionality, and that as Dr. Bichelli says, we know to be true. These are indisputable facts. So once we know that, we know all we need to know to take action.
Okay, so my question is, can those numbers be put in this report so that it's a more fulsome report, so that we understand everything that we're dealing with?
So we can put in, I just made a note here to add the disproportionality indices. So those numbers can be put into the report. Yes.
All right, thanks. Marco, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, so the indices that you're speaking of are specific to this board, or those are the general?
No, they're specific to
Okay.
our students and our board.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I thought
And
you
they
were talking
relate
about...
specifically to the numbers that Superintendent Fowler included in that suspension report.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right, so seeing no further questions, thank you both for that presentation.